On Tuesday, April 23rd at 6 p.m., the DSR Network and the New Republic will be co-hosting an evening featuring a conversation with Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. The event will take place at the National Press Club. If you are a member and live or will be in the D.C. area and would like to attend, please email Riley Fessler at rmfessler@trgmedia.com. That's rmfessler@trgmedia.com. We have a few seats still available and would love to see you there.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. Now that Mike Johnson has allowed Ukraine aid to pass the House, which it did over the weekend by a large bipartisan margin, Marjorie Taylor Greene is angrier than ever. She is reiterating her threat to hold a vote to oust Johnson as Speaker, which could come as early as this week. But something funny has happened here. For various reasons, Greene's efforts could end up accomplishing little for the MAGA right, even as they end up doing more to imperil the Republican Party's hopes of keeping control of the House. To understand why, we've invited Democratic Representative Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania back on the show, because he's one of the shrewder observers out there of how all these House dynamics really work. Welcome back, Congressman.
Great to be back with you.
Okay, so the House has passed the package of bills, including $60 billion in aid to Ukraine and $26 billion for Israel, including humanitarian assistance, and the Senate is expected to move them forward this week. President Biden will sign them, and Marjorie Taylor Greene still hasn't given up. Here's what she told Fox News over the weekend.
Mike Johnson has betrayed America. He's betrayed Republican voters. Under his leadership, he's passed the Democrat agenda, passed the Biden administration's policies, and fully funded them. We're going to fight in Congress to do everything we can to stop this type of uniparty leadership. Mike Johnson's speakership is over. He needs to do the right thing to resign and allow us to move forward in a controlled process. If he doesn't do so, he will be vacated.
Congressman, what do we know about how much support this ouster effort has among MAGA Republicans? Do you anticipate a motion to vacate actually getting a vote? And if so, how many Democrats do you anticipate will vote to table this to save Johnson?
Well, first, it's wonderful to be discussing this after a big and emphatic vote in the House for Ukraine aid. As we discussed some weeks ago, I thought that the path was still very much in play, and I predicted that if it got a full vote on the House floor, it would get more than 300 votes. Every Democrat voting for it, and close to half of House Republicans. And fortunately, that is exactly what happened. And now the bill is over in the Senate, where I think it will be approved, also on a large bipartisan basis in short order. In terms of what comes next for the operations of the House, if Marjorie Taylor Greene is unhappier than ever, then that means I am happier than ever. I encourage MTG to bring that motion to vacate against Mike Johnson. I think there'll be something very healthy when she brings it, and that it is frankly defeated. I don't know why really anyone on my side would want to in any way aid and abet her repeated efforts to make the House more dysfunctional. I think that in many ways what we saw in recent days was probably the best moment the House has had ever since Democrats controlled it in the last 2 years. And I, for one, would like to keep that going.
Yeah, and so I think a fair amount of Democrats will vote to save Johnson. Do you have a sense of how many? I mean, there's been some talk among Democrats about trying to extract a little more. Is that plausible? And if not, how many Democrats end up voting for Johnson here, do you think, roughly?
Well, I would point out that something that our leader, Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, said literally standing on the grounds of the White House probably about 6 weeks ago, and it received precious little notice from the media at the time, but it was very significant. He said, standing there after the Four Corners meeting, that if Mike Johnson was willing to, quote, do the right thing when it comes to Ukraine and allowing the full House to have a vote and work its will, he predicted that there would be a number of Democratic members who would choose to vote present, wouldn't actually vote for Mike Johnson for Speaker, but would make the determination that whoever is going to lead the Republican conference is a matter for them to decide, not for us, and that we weren't going to essentially, in the end, aiding and abetting some of the worst actors in politics today. Now, in terms of how many members there are, I already know of a dozen or so House Democrats who have publicly said that they would be willing to vote present. That is far more than I think Mike Johnson will need. Frankly, the latest I hear is that Marjorie Taylor Greene and Massey are even having a tough time getting to the 8 number that ultimately took out Kevin McCarthy last October. So again, I point to the prediction I just made a few moments ago. I think that if she does file the motion, the first vote will be a motion to table, and I think that would pass by a pretty large number.
That would be an extraordinary outcome. And I do want to give you credit, Congressman. You did come on the show a few weeks back and you said you weren't prepared to give up on Ukraine aid. You were right about that. So let's say that a bunch of Democrats step forward and table the motion. Maybe Greene tries again, fails, rages a bunch more. If that happens, does it defang the MAGA opposition to him in some significant sense? What does that look like? What does it mean going forward?
It doesn't entirely defang it, but I think it would deal it a very serious blow. I've always argued, both internally but also publicly, that it was in Mike Johnson's interest to go down this path and work with Democrats to a certain degree, not just on the Ukraine bill, but it would free him up to be a stronger speaker in a way that Kevin McCarthy never was. Because now he can feel like he doesn't need to be held over a barrel by, really some of the most extreme members ever to serve in Congress in my lifetime. So I think it is very healthy for the issues that we still have to deal with moving forward. Really, there aren't too many of them as we look toward the rest of the year, especially with a presidential election coming up. But let's not forget, believe it or not, we are still on the clock when it comes to the budget. We have until September 30th, or we would be looking at a government shutdown of the next fiscal year. I do think that this whole experience frees Mike Johnson up to be stronger, to make an agreement with us and not feel like he has to be held hostage the way Kevin McCarthy constantly felt that way.
It seems to me that Greene is trying to accomplish something pretty specific, right? Even if she fails, even if Democrats do bail out Johnson, then she and MAGA get to scream that he's really the Democrats' speaker. That'll be good for fundraising and clicks and online outrage, right. And Steve Bannon can rage about it on his podcast. So is it possible under those conditions for a speaker bailed out by Democrats to oversee the GOP conference? How does that play out?
So I've long observed this. Most members of the Freedom Caucus and all House Democrats have something in common. We would all prefer Democrats to be in the majority in the House. Because if you're one of the performance artists on the far right, it's actually more problematic for you to be in the majority. It's far better for your clicks, for your fundraising, to have a Speaker Pelosi or soon-to-be Speaker Hakeem Jeffries to rail against a Democrat in the White House. That's actually better for their own politics and why they're in this, which has absolutely nothing to do with policy or legislation. So you're exactly right. I mean, either way, politically, some of those worst actors benefit regardless of what the actual policy outcome is. There is one other point that I want to make, and I know we're focusing on what happens next in the House, and appropriately so. But I do hope we don't too quickly go over this moment. we may have just saved freedom and independence in Ukraine and prevented a wider European war. That's how big the stakes were when it came to this vote.
I think there's no question that this is an enormous moment, and I really wonder what the global ramifications will be for perceptions of the United States. I think maybe the rising autocratic forces around the world were kind of looking forward to essentially saying, "Look, liberal democracies couldn't hold the line. They're decadent. They're spent. A little pressure and they all fall apart. Putin was right. He waited them out, and it succeeded." Do you get a sense of what perceptions of the United States acting here is abroad?
Well, I will soon be able to have those direct conversations. I am hosting more than 50 parliamentarians who serve in their own country's parliaments, but also serve alongside me and some other members of Congress in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I will be hosting them here in Philadelphia on Thursday and Friday. I expect it to be far more celebratory than it was just about 6 weeks ago when we last gathered in Brussels for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and then the weekend before that in Munich for the Munich Security Conference. So I look forward to having those direct conversations. I think they will be about 180 degrees different than all of the conversations I've had over the previous 6 to 9 months, which were frankly of an urgent and dire nature.
And was there a sense during those conversations that what was at stake here was whether liberal democracies are spent, whether they're decadent, that sort of thing?
Yeah, and that fear will remain less so, but it still remains because any American who has had the experience of traveling abroad over the last year has probably had the same experience that I've had, and that is people coming up to you, whether they're conservative or liberal in their own country, expressing fear about a return of Trump, what it means for the future of democracy, not only in the United States but in the world. That fear still remains because the outcome of this upcoming election is in doubt. But I would say that that fear will be far less so because of what we were able to achieve in recent days, and because of the fact not only did we get a unanimous Democratic vote, we got well over 45% of House Republicans as well.
It is an amazing number, and your point is taken that even if Trump wins this fall, obviously we're not out of the woods when it comes to the fate of liberal democracy. But even if he wins, then the amount of damage he can do to the Ukrainian cause will have been substantially minimized by the renewal of aid. Now, let me ask you about the question of whether coalition governing in the House is really possible. Is there something Democrats can do here to encourage more of this strangely productive behavior from House Republicans? Can they get something more? And I don't mean in a crass exchange. I mean more, are there possibilities for coalitions to do more things going forward?
I would argue de facto we have been in coalition government in the House for at least the last year.
Hmm.
Um, Absolutely every bill that has passed, that has been signed into law, has passed with a significant number of Democratic votes. In fact, oftentimes more Democratic yes votes than Republican votes. That was the case last June to raise the debt ceiling. It was the case repeatedly to keep the government funded or open while we were working on what the final package would look like. And then it was so again once we had the final vote to ensure that we wouldn't be in a shutdown for the rest of the fiscal year. And it was again on this piece of legislation. So, whether anyone really notices it or not, frankly, on anything significant, we have been in de facto coalition government in the House for at least the past year.
Is there more that can be done?
Well, I would argue that actually Democrats have already gotten a lot as it is. I mean, when you look at the shape of this package, the fact that there was absolutely no concessions on the border in the end in order to get this passed. By the way, thank you, Donald Trump. You're such a brilliant three-dimensional chess player that you were able to unintentionally assist Democrats when it comes to that. When you look at the shape of what the budget looks like for the rest of this fiscal year, when you look at what Republicans were pushing for, and then what the final package looked like, it was significantly more of a Democratic win than a Republican win. Ultimately, in order to take more of a step forward, though, and build on the enormous successes of the Congress that served, the 117th Congress that served in 2021 and 2022, and pass some of the most forward-looking, substantial domestic policy legislation since the 1960s. For that to happen, it will take an outright Democratic majority and a Democrat in the Speaker's chair after November.
Okay, well, to get a little darker here, it seems to me that Mike Johnson, presuming he survives, will have to do some serious damage control with the MAGA base and right wing media. So, one way might be to move forward with impeaching President Biden, yet that whole effort has crashed and burned on their lack of facts. So, maybe he holds votes on sending criminal referrals to the Department of Justice based on the invented crimes that they quote unquote discovered. Do you anticipate something like that? Is that enough to smooth things over with MAGA? What else might he do to try and mend fences?
I wouldn't be surprised if you did see a bunch of red meat conservative resolutions over the next several weeks and months. But in the end, they'll be performative and not actually signed into law. It's not something I will get terribly worried about. As far as Mike Johnson's, future leading the Republican conference, I tend to think, regardless of what he did in this situation, he was in a very challenging position. As frankly, every single Republican who has led the House Republicans post Denny Hastert has been in a similar situation. I mean, I have seen, just in my own career, 10 years in Congress, I have seen four Republican speakers. Three of them have had a motion to vacate filed against them, one of which, of course, succeeded. And then the fourth, Paul Ryan, announced he wasn't running again pretty early on into his first and only full term as Speaker, which really kind of, killed in its infancy any attempt to try to take him out. So the reality is, I'd be pretty fatalistic if I were a political advisor to Mike Johnson. I tend to think whatever he does, he's going to have a challenging time post November. And if they lose the majority, as I hope and believe they will, then it will actually make it, in some ways, maybe easier for him to hold on to a majority of his conference as minority leader than if he were to actually be a speaker designate.
Here's where it gets really interesting as well. To go back to something you brought up earlier, now that Ukraine and Israel aid has passed the House, there's very little essential business left for the House to do, particularly since we're entering the election, which makes passing major legislation harder. There will be the need to fund the government later this year, which you mentioned, and that could be trouble. But is there much else? I mean, in a way, Marjorie Taylor Greene raging now isn't all that consequential, right? Because there isn't much more of great importance that she can wreck.
That's exactly right. And I think is a big reason why Mike Johnson was delaying this longer than we would have liked, because he did want to wrap up all of the budget bills necessary to fund the government through the rest of this year until September 30th. He wanted to wrap up FISA reauthorization and kind of save this as the last big piece of legislation that we have to do until we deal with the fiscal year 2025 budget. So, it's for someone like me who actually wants to achieve certain things and see progress on important priorities like the child tax credit and pre-K funding and those sorts of things. It's not exactly encouraging, but it also means that the risk is a lot lower than, say, if we were in this situation 6 months ago.
And maybe there's a more plausible shot at winning the House for Democrats as well as this unfolds. Because, I mean, look, Greene could continue to damage GOP hopes of holding the House in many ways, right? Okay, if she succeeds in ousting Johnson, that would produce more chaos, make Republicans look terrible at governing. That seems unlikely, but even if not, all the messiness of trying to oust the speaker blows back on the GOP too, and whatever crazy and extreme things Mike Johnson does to repair relations with MAGA also blow back on the party. So it seems to me that that's how this goes from here, no?
Well, that would be very similar to what we've seen over the last 16 months or so. I mean, if you're one of those 18 or so congressional Republicans in New York State or California or Arizona, where most of the Biden won districts represented by Republicans sit, what exactly do you have to run on? I mean, absolutely nothing. Um, every single time that crowd has failed to stand up for themselves and failed to in any way prove that they were the moderates that they claimed to be. Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Freedom Caucus folks have actually stood up time and time again. I don't like it. It creates an enormous amount of dysfunction. But boy, they've certainly fought 100 times harder than any of the frontline Republicans have on their side of the aisle. And it's so different from how our frontline Democrats asserted themselves repeatedly 2 years ago, whether it was through Build Back Better or Inflation Reduction Act or some of the other pieces of legislation that we were working on. So when you couple that with a strengthening economy, I have to say that I am bullish when it comes to our chances to win back the House this November.
So, to add it all up, Democrats got Ukraine aid, and there isn't much more of serious consequence that Greene can threaten. And she's going to continue making the GOP case for holding the House look even worse than it already does. In a way, it's kind of shaping up as the best of all possible worlds for Democrats, no?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I feel the need at this point to just make clear no, she is not secretly on our payroll, even though her antics and behavior in many ways are more productive for the Democratic side politically than they are for her own side. But the reality is, um, and this saddens me a great deal, the future of the House Republican Conference looks more like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and others than it does people like, I think of people I served with like Charlie Dent and other similarly aligned Republicans. Because what really worries me in terms of the future as we look, 2025 and beyond, a number of the more pragmatic institutionalist Republicans, say the folks who ultimately voted yes on Ukraine aid, once they retire, they are increasingly being replaced in primaries by MAGA types. So the short term, 2024, and this election, I'm optimistic. But as we look longer term than that, I remain still very concerned about the future of one of America's two major political parties.
Certainly not looking great right now, given especially the fact that they're almost certain to rally around Trump even more intensely as his legal travails get worse. I wonder, can I ask you on that score? So we have seen some defiance of MAGA here, but it sort of seems like these things are selective. They don't always happen. In this case, Trump seems to have had some kind of conversation with Mike Johnson. Maybe Trump recognized that he was going that Ukraine aid was going to pass, so he didn't want to look as if he was losing influence. So he kind of aligned himself with it in some way. Maybe Republicans figured out a clever way to make him think that he was actually winning by putting part of the aid to Ukraine in the form of a loan. That's absurd, but whatever. It worked, right? Trump didn't raise too much of a fuss. But that seems to have been required for Republicans to get to yes. What happens down the road? Do you anticipate any kind of serious rebellion from House Republicans against the demand from MAGA that they rally around Trump as his legal travails kind of go into the toilet?
Oh, I think that the overwhelming majority of congressional Republicans, both in the House and in the Senate, though maybe still a little less so in the Senate. Nonetheless, I think the vast majority are fully aligned with Trump. If a microphone is put in their faces, they will come up with any sort of justification for why they're supporting Trump. Biden is allegedly the worst of both evils, or some sort of, verbal gymnastics in that regard. No, I mean, the reality is there are precious few people who have been willing to stand up to Trump, even though they know better. In the House, I served with two of them, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. Neither of them are here today. Adam was a pretty good, and still is, a pretty good friend of mine. We co-led a caucus together when it came to trying to aid the effort in Syria to try to resist the Assad regime and help working with diaspora groups to help those poor, suffering, innocent people who were still stuck there. The reality is, though, the folks, who were most forceful in standing up for what's right and speaking out against Trump were either defeated in primaries or chose to leave. And we basically, since Ken Buck just retired, I can't think of really one in the House Republican Conference.
Well, the way I read that is enjoy all the good feelings while they're here, because they're not going to last very long. Congressman Brendan Boyle, thank you so much for coming on with us today.
All right. Thank you, Greg.
Folks, please make sure to check out our new special issue devoted to political influencers. It's packed with information about 25 young, up-and-coming voices you absolutely need to be following as we head into this fall's elections. It's live at tnr.com right now. We'll see you tomorrow. You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler and the DSR Network.